Why does it become an addiction, like running and exercising? What is the feeling? Obviously, exercise and working out has never been a drug of choice of mine, but I know a lot of people that get into it. What is that feeling that they feel that changes the way they feel?
Yeah, that's such a good question.
Gina Tucci, you go ahead and say it.
Karnisovas.
Yeah, there you go. Welcome to the show, Into the Rock. My name is Michael Molthan, and she just introduced herself. I'm gonna call you uh, GTK. That's your nickname on Into the Rock. How
Okay.
about that? Thank you so much for coming on the show. Gina is a mental strength coach and a licensed counselor. Her graduate program is focused on sports psychology and mental health counseling. We're going to stop right there. Sports psychology.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow. So you must be a little sports junkie.
Yeah, I am. I grew up in and around sports pretty much my whole life. And I got into sports psychology. I think I had shared with you um, that what brought me to sports psychology wasn't my acumen in sports and that I was a great athlete and had all the answers, but really my own struggles in sports and kind of finding some of those answers, sort of an aha moment in college where I sat down in a sports psychology class and had this sort of aha moment that, you know, cued me into the idea that, wow, what I was thinking and feeling actually had an impact on how my body was performing. And so it really took that one class, literally almost that one day, and I was hooked. I just thought I can't be the only athlete that struggles with these things. Um, and so I became a sports psychology junkie um, that that sort of pulled along my athletic career from there. So,
Hey, what was your sport? What was your final favorite sport that you focused on?
oh, wow, that's a tough question because I loved every sport I've done and competed in. Um, I think ultimately my favorite sport was in martial arts was Taekwondo. And yeah,
Why is
I
that? Why is that?
so Taekwondo was a very different challenge for me. Um, I played team sports growing up in high school, and then in college I started running distance, and distance running became a sort of therapy for me. And so it became a therapy, and sometimes it became a way to almost punish myself in not a healthy way.
Yeah.
So there was a very kind of interesting relationship with me and running. And it was so different to experience martial arts. I'd always been interested in martial arts. I'd always been interested in the philosophy behind martial arts. And so much of it really is like foundational to some of the tenets in sports psychology. And so I quickly saw that sort of alignment and synergy and wanted to learn more about it, but really just didn't have the time in college in my young adult life. And I got into it much later as an adult. And part of what I loved about it was that it was so different than running. And it really forced me to slow down and become present. Whereas running, there was an element of where I could kind of dissociate from, what I was doing, and especially with long distance running. Um, yeah, so it was
So
very.
so running it kind of puts you you were alone and at peace, and you touched on something also to punish yourself. uh can exercise be an addiction?
Oh, 100%. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
People
And
people
I've
can
heard you
overdo it.
say, and I've listened to you talk. Yeah, you can overdo anything, right? And anything can really become an addiction. And it was an addiction for me without question, for a large part of my life, for sure.
And why does it become an addiction, like running and exercising? What is the feeling? Obviously, exercise and working out has never been a drug of choice of mine, but I know a lot of people that get into it. What is that feeling that they feel that changes the way they feel?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And I think it's probably there are different elements to it. So, you know, I look at how those things impact us from kind of a triangulated approach. So like a biopsychosocial approach, right? Like there's something going on in the biology, you know, and people talk about the runner's high and the endorphins and sort of that the neurochemical stuff that goes on. There's also that the psychology and psychological component of it, that there was an identity to it, an identity piece of like, I'm a runner, I'm a distance runner, I can do hard things, I can do things that other people can't, you know, I can push myself beyond, you know, levels of discomfort, etc. And then the social piece, even though I would compete as an individual, in most of the things that I did, there was a social aspect to it of like identifying with the runners group, you know, and I had running partners too, so I wasn't always running alone. But there was that social aspect of it too, of like finding other runners, you know, and
Mm.
like-minded folks. So I think, as with any addiction, it's filling something. It's filling a void. It's filling that sense of maybe an emptiness, or finding meaning or a source. You've used the word source before, and I thought that was such a great way to describe how anything can become an addiction. And so it definitely was for me in that way for many years.
So let's pivot back to your line of work. Mental strength coach. Okay. When we very first we talked offline just to get to know each other. I wish we would have recorded that. That was a great conversation. And um do I have this right? You don't want to be called a sports psychologist. You much rather be called a mental strength coach, right? What does that mean?
Yeah. So my background again is, though it's academically in sports psychology and mental health. Um, you know, over the years, I've recognized that really what is most important is, do you have like a foundation of mental fitness tools? And what does that really mean? And so often I hear from coaches, you know, like, my athletes aren't mentally tough. And my feeling about around that is, it's not that they're not mentally tough, but they're not mentally trained, you know, or they're mentally unfit in a way. So I wouldn't take an athlete as a strength and conditioning coach and walk them into a weight room and say, okay, here you go, just get stronger, you know, without telling them what weights to lift, what exercises to do, what is the structure and the format of that. So, nor would I expect somebody to just, you know, automatically know what it is to become mentally stronger. Um, you know, I think we all have inherent gifts and in skills and tools, and some of us are better at certain, maybe mental strength tools or mental fitness tools just naturally, than others. But just like with strength and conditioning, physical strength and conditioning, we can also improve our ability to be efficient and effective, in deploying those tools. So I see it kind of as a parallel, a really strong parallel.
And what's the range of your clientele that you work with?
So the range is, the youngest folks that I work with, youngest athletes that I work with, are around 15, 14, 15 years old.
Mhm.
And then all the way up through professional athletes, retired athletes, um, veterans as well, and first responders. So I kind of run the gamut on the athletic population, and sort of I've been really blessed to work with a lot of elite performers, um, and in different areas, in different chapters of their lives and journeys as well.
And what genre besides, you know, how would you work with an NFL football player and a PGA Tour golfer? Is it the same approach?
Yeah, yes and no. So yes, from a foundational, like a foundational tools perspective, kind of my first approach really is starts with like mindset and kind of getting a sense of where's this person starting in terms of their mindset. Do they have they adopted the like a growth mindset or an elite mindset? And I think that's really critical because a lot of people, it's interesting to me when I start to talk about that. A lot of people have a little bit of an idea of what a growth mindset is, but not more of maybe a complete picture of what that actually looks like in their own lives,
Mhm.
and the differences and where we all have some maybe fixed mindset, or I call it average mindset, belief systems that can sort of creep in. And so recognizing that first and foremost, and then kind of a level of self-awareness, like, where are my challenges, where are my strengths, etc. So from that standpoint, PGA golfer versus an NFL player, I like to start with kind of an understanding of somebody's foundation. But then maybe some of the more nuanced pieces of what their experience is like, and then how to build tools around, actually applying performance techniques and performance strategies that might look a little different.
Do you find that these athletes at the and just for this show, not just not discriminating anybody out, but just for this talk, a professional athlete, top level, household name, all this stuff, that you work with, do you find that this becomes their god? This is who they are. It's not a narcissistic deal, but this is who they are. And then when they retire or injury takes them out of the game, I would think that's where you'd really come in because of the trauma. And here I am left alone to myself. Now, what do I do? The structure and routine is over immediately that they've been doing since they've been working with you since the age of 15. I
Mm.
mean, when you get that client, do you monitor that and start preparing them for the future?
Yeah, I think in an ideal world, like, starting with somebody young and then kind of building these tools along the way, like that would be a perfect world, right? That's
Right.
not necessarily what my experience has been. A lot of times folks come to me when they're struggling, when they're already struggling with
That's
something.
right. Makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. So with respect to your question, like to go back to the beginning part of it, I think what occurs with a lot of athletes is sort of identity foreclosure, where, I am a basketball player, I am a football player, in this sense of like my value and my worth comes from what I do. If I'm a good basketball player, I have value and worth. If I'm a bad basketball player, I have less value and less worth. And I think where we fall short in terms of like youth sports and then leading up to wherever sports takes you, um, is we fall short in building up a sense of identity inclusive of the activities in the sports that you're doing, but really building that sense of like my value and worth comes from who I am. What does that mean? My character traits, my virtues, my values, all of those things.
Just to get more into your world, what is just a common when someone calls you and interviews you, say, "Hey, I need help." And you made a really good point. I mean, it's like, you know, I didn't go to prison on a winning streak. You know what I mean? You're being very radical, okay? Or, but they come to you because they're in need of help. I applaud that, number one. Number two is that what's what is the common thing that you see? What are they don't know what they need help in. What is that thing that they need to get back to where they were at?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say most commonly, what I see what folks come in with is some sort of impact to their confidence. This sense
Mm,
of like, well, I was really confident before, but I'm not confident anymore. Or I'm not,
there you go.
really struggling with that. Um, that's probably what most of my clients will articulate on some level.
I remember when I was a caddy on the professional golf tour. We were talking, briefly, And it's amazing that, you know, watching players, especially the guy that I used to work for, they play real good for a long time. And then they would, hit this little slump. And they always, in the golf world, would always go back to the basics: grip,
Mhm.
stance, and alignment. They basically would just start over, right? It hit the reset button. So I would think that would be something that in all sports, we just go back to, the basics of what got us there.
Right on. Yeah, I think that's so important. And a lot of times what happens is I think we forget the basics. We forget to go back to that and to keep it simple. And and I've done this myself. Like, my instinct is to try harder. Like, oh, I'm not trying hard enough. I'm not pushing hard enough. When sometimes that's the exact opposite of what you need, because that even the idea of trying, it kind of puts us in that like, ooh, maybe there's a threat to my ability to do my sport, or there's a threat to that. It's a much bigger sort of unspoken threat that we're sort of interpreting and then saying, oh, if I only try harder, if I only try harder, when in a lot of cases you're exactly right. Like, the real answer lies in the simplicity of just going back to the fundamentals, the stuff
Right.
that got you to that level to begin with.
Right. And for the viewers and listeners who are watching this, I'm throwing hypotheticals. So I got some good stuff coming up. But for like using golf again as an analogy, Gina, a lot of people who play golf, they're going really good. Okay. They shoot 4 under on the front nine. And then they get 6 under through 13. And then they choke. They call it the choke. All right. Define the choke and how do we overcome that, not only in golf, but even in the business world and in life, that when things are going really good, I just answer my own, I guess it's some sort of mental self-sabotaging. We get out of the present moment, right?
Yeah, exactly. So to me, choking is it is all about expectation, and
Mm,
how expectation like seeps into or sneaks into the whole experience. I've never heard an athlete say like, "Yeah, my best performance was when I was totally locked in on just winning the game or winning the round or winning." Um, it it always comes with athletes talking about, "I really wasn't thinking about much of anything. I was just totally engrossed in the moment and what was right in front of me." Right? And so I think when choking occurs, it occurs because there's some sort of expectation and a shift from being in the moment, the present moment, to some element of the outcome, right? And so that's to me that's something that comes up a lot in my office. It comes up a lot in sports. It comes up a lot in professional sports. So at any and every level, we see athletes that underperform, right? So, the team that has won like 7 games in a row, and then they fall to a team that has a much less stellar record than they do,
right.
so the expectation is totally that they're going to win, they're going to beat them, and then in fact they lose that game and everybody's like, "Oh my gosh, what happened? What happened?" Um, and some can argue like the expectation is it's going to be an easy win. So the team gets complacent, they take their foot off the gas and so on. But if you get down to it at a really basic kind of micro level, they stop paying attention to what was in the moment, what was right in front of them, the simple things, the process, right, to get to that outcome.
So, what are some tools that we can use when we start catching ourselves getting out of the zone? Getting out of the moment. What would you suggest? Some good tools. The reset button.
Yeah, that's such a great question. So the first thing is the most important thing that you said was being able to catch yourself. Like, the magic is that self-awareness, that being able to recognize, oh, I'm getting off track. Why am I thinking about, the end of the game, or why am I thinking about the end of the quarter or my stats or some other outcome measure, right? and being able to catch that. But then in terms of, there are lots of tools and techniques that people can apply. But first and foremost, our breath is our bridge between our body and our mind.
Yeah.
And our breath is what can anchor us back to the present moment.
Yeah.
Because you cannot simultaneously be focused in the present and be anxious about what's going to happen in the future if you're fully present. And so our breath is, I call it a superpower. I think it's one of our least used, and maybe least, like, we don't understand fully the power of the breath. We all hear, like, just take a breath, just relax, all of those, but they're like commands with absolutely no described tools of application. We're saying, okay, we just take a breath. But there's really power in our ability to be able to take that breath. And I think one of the things that that I see happen a lot is that it's not, we don't think to use it until we need it. And so I stress to all my athletes, like, don't wait until you need that breath, but actually, this is something to practice every single day, in a way so that when you do need it, it's a resource for you. And it's not kind of like grasping for the life preserver. It's really part of your process.
And this is good for everybody. I mean, I have to work on it myself. Why is taking a breath and breathing? And you just made me do it right now, and it does. Why is that so important?
Yeah, so like I said, it's the bridge between the mind and the body. And what happens,
Scientifically, what does it do to us?
yeah, so when you think about competition, for example, competition can very quickly put us into a state of fight or flight, right? Fight, flight, or freeze. And so when that part of us is activated, to use like the fancy scientific word, it's the sympathetic nervous system that gets activated. And the role of that part of our brain is really is for survival, right?
Yeah.
Help us survive. And so when that part's activated, those are our three options: fight, flight, or freeze. And generally, we don't make a lot of good decisions from that place
No.
because it's strictly about like survival, right? And the reality is, when we're playing a game, and even when we're in a competition, there really isn't a threat to our survival per se.
Right.
And so where we want to be is some balance of having that sympathetic nervous system activated in the sense that we recognize that something matters here, something's important to us, because that part of our brain also primes us for action. So I'm not vilifying the sympathetic nervous system or that fight or flight response. It needs to be heightened and kind of like, ooh, what's going on here? Because it primes our body and mind for action,
Mm.
purposeful action, right? But there has to be the flexibility of our mind. And that's where the breath comes in. So when we're able to take a breath, take a slow diaphragmatic breath, for example, an intentional breath, there are connections to our vagus nerve. Our vagus nerve extends throughout our body, and our vagus response, when we can activate that, is to signal the brain to activate that parasympathetic side, which allows us to sort of slow our breathing, slow our heart rate, relax our muscles, and also to increase our awareness. So then all of a sudden we have a sense of more options available to us, and better decision making can occur. So it is a delicate balance, but that's also why it's so important for us to be able to practice these tools, like just simple breathing techniques. And there's all kinds of them, but like diaphragmatic breathing, for example, breathing in through your nose and thinking about extending your belly out, and then exhaling through your mouth and pulling your belly in towards your spine. That intentional sort of flex of the diaphragm activates that vagus nerve and that parasympathetic response.
Yeah, I felt good just doing that. I felt
Yeah,
really good. It's
Yeah.
amazing how that works. Oh, that's great. I mean, I love breath work my whole life. I, I was holding my breath all the time, and I have to focus on my breathing, to
Yeah.
get that oxygen to my brain,
Yeah.
to get to the conscious part of my brain. So
Totally.
okay. So your phone rings. Your phone rings today. All right, and it's Patrick Mahomes.
Yeah.
Okay. Coming off, we're on Monday, the day after the Super Bowl, and Patrick Mahomes calls you, and he's devastated and he's grieving, and I've had Gina, I've had the worst game of my life. I don't know what to do. I don't know. I can't even walk out of the house right now. What role do you play in that? How does that look like when that phone call comes in?
Yeah, I was thinking about Patrick Mahomes and the Chiefs and since last night. Um, I think grief is a great word to use there,
Yeah.
um, because there is definitely a grief process that happens after, you go through a really long season like that. And I always think, like, you're in the Super Bowl. The champion of the Super Bowl is not at all surprised that they won.
Right.
And I think Hertz was a really good example of that. His very stoic, kind of like even keel, interviews after the game, I think really exemplify that. I think who's surprised is the team that lost.
Yeah.
And I think there's an element of just kind of shock and devastation that comes with that. Um, and so that phone call, I think the first part is, yeah, give yourself permission to have those feelings and to experience some of that emotion. I think that's really important. Negative emotions aren't meant to, like, be denied or pushed away and, and say, okay, I'm not, like, everything's fine. I'm not feeling those emotions, because negative emotions, I think, serve a really powerful role in indicating that we need to take action in some way. Um, and so I would encourage Patrick to recognize it, experience it, but don't stay in it too long, because then it doesn't serve you. So beyond those initial emotions, um, it should be the impetus for action, right?
Right.
Versus a signal that something is horribly wrong and now something's over and something's final. It should actually signal, like, okay, what's important next from here to move forward from this, and now to grow in some way. What can be learned from that experience?
Right. And then also, hey, what are you grateful for? Look at
Yeah.
all the great things that have been accomplished in that, and go from that. All right. So then Jalen Hurts calls you right after Patrick does. Okay. He calls you and he says, hey, man, we just won the Super Bowl and all that stuff, but I want to stay at this level. How do I stay at this level?
I would say
Do you ever get those calls?
yeah. Actually, yeah. I
I'm
have.
doing really good. I want to stay here.
Yeah, I have had some of those calls. There's usually some kind of catalyst, like something that happens that that feeling of staying there has become threatened,
Mm,
in some way. And so there's kind of that call. But this idea of, like, hey, I want to stay there, I would say enjoy it, have fun, celebrate it, and then get back to work. Go back to get back
right.
to those basics, those fundamentals.
Right. Um, let's switch over to mental health.
Hmm.
Mental health. We kind of played around this in the mental strength coaching, sports psychology world. Mental health. You know, trauma is widely used. It's a hot word going around right now, and you and I briefly talked about it. That trauma it's a wide range. Trauma is trauma. And with your clients, when you recognize and you hear trauma, maybe a lot of times that when we do get in a slump, either in the sports world, business world, life, family, and we're being triggered um, from unresolved trauma, how do you dive into that with your clients to get the solution to be free of that?
Yeah. So say a little bit more about that question in terms of like the unresolved trauma, how that shows up in sports or how that shows up in.
Sure, with your client, when you're working with your client and you notice that they come to you that they're struggling with this part of their game,
Mhm.
but what you're hearing is the reason why we're stuck is because you're being triggered from some unresolved trauma. Does that make sense?
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah.
How do you work through that? What are your tools that you provide them that our listeners can learn from?
Yeah, I it's so trauma can show up for everybody very differently,
Right.
um and in terms of like what triggers it for one person is, again, very very unique to the individual. I think one of the things that I focus the most on, so when we talk about trauma and when trauma is experienced, I think one of the hallmarks of trauma is the feeling of being out of control. And this, which is really scary for people, right? Like when we experience anxiety, anxiety comes from a feeling of being out of control. And so, one of the things that I try to really build in the clients that I work with, all the clients, doesn't matter if they're youth athletes, like semi-pro, professional athletes, or athletes in retirement and they're kind of going through a different, chapter of their life, is building a sense of agency, a sense of like self-command. Um, and I think that is is a great place to start. And whether or not like the root of their trauma or the story of their trauma experience unfolds in our work together, um, that doesn't necessarily, it isn't necessarily a prerequisite for us doing complete work. But one of the things that I feel is my responsibility as a mental strength coach and as a mental health professional is helping them gain a sense of agency. And what does that look like, in their world? What does daily self command look like? Uh, and so a lot of that involves conversations about like their fundamentals and their fundamental habits. What are the things that you're doing? What are the things that are in your control versus not in your control? And getting some clarity on that.
It's a hot topic, head trauma, concussions,
Yeah.
which is medical, along with psychology, uh, educate me and the listeners on that, the head trauma that we're hearing. I have a friend right now who has had some head trauma, 40 something concussions. And
Yeah.
then, is, gotten on alcohol and trying to ease the pain and suffering. So what are the solutions? When we say I need help, what does that look like for concussion? What's the right wordsmithing? People who suffered lots of concussions,
Yeah. Um, so just I'm not, a head trauma expert or a concussion
right?
expert by any means. Um, but to your point, there's a biological component to it and stuff that's going on a neurological level. Um, including just some vulnerabilities that are created in the environment of head trauma. And it's my understanding that when people suffer concussions, there's a disruption in the blood-brain barrier.
Right.
And when that occurs, there's vulnerabilities and susceptibilities to all sorts of things, um, and including addiction and addictive behaviors, including even some, immune and autoimmune um, kind of things as well. So from that side of things it's really, really important to get a specialist, I think, on your team and get that kind of attention, first and foremost. In the context of what are the psychological impacts, I think one of the psychological impacts that is a there's a potential for sure is actually around kind of a grief of having lost a certain level of health, um, and sort of that feeling of vulnerability. There's almost like a grief and a trauma that occurs in that idea, of I used to feel this way. I used to feel, like, for example, one of the common things that people struggle with after concussion is brain fog, or sometimes there are physical manifestations of frequent headaches and sensitivity to light, sensitivity to noise, different things that people used to be able to tolerate, now they can't tolerate. And so there is a disruption to that, to their psychological well-being that's associated with that. And that's really challenging. And so I feel like when somebody has gone through a lot of concussions, it's really important for people to have like a team approach to that, because you have sort of a medical side of things. And then also behaviorally, having a coach, a mental strength coach or a mental health professional, somebody to help them with like reestablishing what are the most healthy behaviors that I can have that are going to promote my healing and growth and overcoming the experiences of those head trauma.
Well said. Well said. Let me throw this out to you. If you were to look at, how do I say this? From abroad, professional athletes that are faith based and professional athletes that are non faith based, who performs better?
Hmm. Wow. I've never done any research. I mean, I don't
I just thought of that.
know. Yeah, I don't know the answer to that, to be perfectly honest. I know my gut, my gut experience, my gut related to my professional experience has been that, and this is probably more on the clinical work I've done, is that I find that when there is a faith background or a faith base, even if it's a little bit ambiguous, and folks feel like, I'm not really sure exactly what I believe, but I know that there's something out there, something bigger. Um, I find that they generally do better. The prognosis in terms of mental health growth is tends to be better. Um, for athletes, I really don't know, because I've never done any research in that area, but I think it's a great question. It'd be really,
Well,
really
I mean,
cool to
it's really
explore.
been neat watching, just on the social media world, how these athletes are putting Christ on blast. I mean, really, they're really putting him number one, and
Mhm.
saying how it's a movement that I'm seeing and feeling, and it's so good to see. It's so good to see that good stuff out there that's saying, hey, but if I translate for him, what I'm seeing is that you know God doesn't care who wins the Super Bowl.
Right.
God's not interested in celebrities, he's not interested in titles. He's interested in one thing, and that's servants. That's what he's interested in. And I find it really neat that we see this movement, happening right now, and I applaud that. And do you put faith into your curriculum and share that with your clients? Hey, man, you want to try it this way,
Yeah, so my role is always to kind of meet my clients where they're at.
right?
Uh, and so when one of my questions kind of on an intake is, is spirituality important to you? Is your faith important to you?
Hmm.
And I'm 100% there and all in on having those conversations and discussions. And I will tell you, the majority of my clients, um, and throughout my career, have had some sort of faith background. And it can look very different for different people. But I think, to your point, this idea of like playing for something bigger than yourself, and playing for, I think the coach yesterday of the Eagles made the comment, something about the power of love. And I
Yeah, I
thought
heard
that was
that.
such an interesting comment, because, you know, I personally feel like love is the one of the most powerful emotions that we can experience and that we share as human beings, and love comes from somewhere, right? Like, where does it come from? Like, what is that? And it can be really hard to like operationalize. But love, I think we can have love of sport, love of, love of self, love of, but it's kind of this common thread in a way. And I think it actually represents something much, much bigger, right? And it's that idea of playing for something bigger than yourself. And I think a lot of people, it resonates with them, this idea of like, of playing for God or for Christ that has given them the gifts that they have, the ability to be able to do what they do. And so there's an element of gratitude in that as well. And so, yeah, I think your question is a really good one. I may have mentioned to you when we talked, a friend of mine, his name is Brian Johnson, wrote a book called Verite, and he has a company called Heroic. And I went to hear him talk about his book Verite, and when he launched it, and when I was there, he defined the word hero, and from the Greek etymology of that word, and he said, hero means protector. It means someone with the strength for two. Um, and when he said that, it really captivated me, that definition, because I thought of it in terms of like athletics and teams. And while I was sitting there, it occurred to me, I'm like, oh my gosh, that's so interesting because, talent wins games. Like whether if you're talented or you're not talented, talent wins games. Nobody would argue that. But heroes win championships. It comes down to like playing for each other and playing, I think, through that common thread of love, right? Love for your teammates, love for your God, love for your sport, and the ability to be able to do that. And there's sort of a humility in it of like, it's not just about me. It's about what can we do for each other? What can we do together as a collective? So I thought that was so
I
powerful.
love that.
Yeah.
I love that. Gina, as we land this plane, this has been wonderful. And for everyone who is watching or listening to this, we'll have all of her contact information in the description below. Let's have some fun. You want to? I've been having fun, but let's kind of shift the view here a little bit.
Yeah.
Who is your favorite NFL football team?
Favorite NFL football team. My dad is going to kill me, but the Giants, New York Giants. I
Come
know.
on.
Too.
Mine's the Cowboys. All right, your favorite Major League Baseball team?
New York Yankees.
Oh my God, I know where we're going with this. Okay, your favorite PGA Tour male golfer?
Oh, McElroy, without question. Yeah.
Why is that?
I just really like him. He's down to earth. Seems like a down to earth person. Not I don't know him personally. Yeah, I like his approach to the game. Yeah.
Favorite NBA team?
Okay, I have to go with the Chicago Bulls at the moment. That can change. Yeah.
Why is that? Why do you have to go with them?
Yeah. Yeah. My husband works is affiliated with the Bulls, and yeah, so I'm kind of bound by that. My favorite team in the West is the Denver Nuggets. So
Okay,
yeah.
is where you live at, and so how did y'all meet? You and your husband? How'd that happen? Was he a client?
No, no, no,
Needed help?
yeah, no, not a client. We met in college when I was 18. We went to college together at Seton Hall. He was a
Okay,
junior, I was a freshman. Yeah.
that
Yeah.
makes sense. Seton Hall always has a good basketball program. So
Yeah,
if
the
you,
days of the Big East.
that's right. If you
Them.
could have lunch with one person for 1 hour, living or dead, who would that be?
Phil Jackson.
Phil Jackson. Why is that?
So when I first started studying sports psychology and kind of what my
Mm,
interest was growing in that in college. That was back in the 90s. I'm totally dating myself, but Phil Jackson was like one of the very first, at least in my exposure, the first professional coach that like really talked about the mind body connection, and talked about it in a, in a forum that was so like, the Bulls were really coming into their own, and they were on the rise, and that was like a super exciting time to be a Chicago Bulls fan. And he kind of normalized the talk around, the mind and the body being connected. And his nickname was like the Zen Master. So I always really admired that. And then to be able to put together a string of championships, like it's hard enough to win one championship,
right.
but to be able to replicate that in successive years, like I just, yeah, I admire his ability to do that. And I think it says something about his ability to coach. Like I always think of coaching as like being a good coach is like being a good teacher. You have to be able to speak the language of your students or speak the language of your athletes. And often everybody's speaking different languages, like
Right.
the words and the language, and it resonates differently with different people. So
Right.
yeah,
Well
I
said.
always admired him.
That's a good one. Well, Gina, we are so grateful to have you on the show. I'm so grateful we met, and I look forward to our friendship and having you on a lot to talk about different topics. I kind of wanted to do an icebreaker show for people to get to know you, but have you back on to talk on specific topics, trauma,
Great.
grief, depression, anxiety, paranoia, all these different topics. So we can just tackle that one topic. So I'm looking forward to having you back on the show. So we really appreciate you. We'll have your website up and everything. Make sure y'all subscribe to this and hit the notifications so you get alerts of new shows coming up. Gina, always in the show this way is I got 3 words. It's got 8 letters and it's got one meaning, and that is I love you.
No,
We
I
appreciate
love
you.
you too. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to talk to you, and so grateful for this connection. This is really great. Thank you so much
Ab-
for having me.
Absolutely. From all of us here at M2 The Rock, you go make it a great day.